Hi everybody, and welcome back to Japan This Week. Today we'll talk about the latest tensions between North Korea and Japan, and a quick follow-up on the tourism and economic situation. As usual, I'll leave you all my sources in the description, and if you like the video, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. And now, without further ado, let's look at the news. Between September 25 and October 9, North Korea performed a series of 7 missile launches, testing a total of 12 missiles in what has been considered to be the latest provocation to Japan and its allies. The most newsworthy launch has been conducted on October 4th, when, in the morning, North Korea fired an intermediate-range ballistic missile all across Japan. Upon detecting the anomaly, an emergency communication system called J-Alert issued an emergency communication to take shelter to the waking populations of Hokkaido, Aomori, and the islands of Izu and Ogasawara. According to the Japanese Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada, the weapon flew 4,600 kilometers, a bit less than 2,900 miles, traveled 1 minute over Aomori, and landed in the Pacific Ocean 3,200 kilometers east of the Tohoku region. If you're like me and you feel like the last 3 years have been completely erased from your memory, it will seem that this is, unfortunately, nothing out of the ordinary. But in reality, it has been since 2017 that North Korea hadn't launched a missile that flew across Japan. Therefore, let's recap the international situation. North Korea is a totalitarian dictatorship stuck between Russia, China, and South Korea. Since Japan relinquished control of Korea in 1945, the country was divided in two along the 38th parallel, and while the South was occupied by the United States and imported capitalism, the North was occupied by the Soviet Union. In 1948, separate governments were formed, and in 1950, North Korea attacked the South, starting what is now known as the Korean War. In 1953, an armistice was signed, but to this day, there is no peace treaty. The fall of the Soviet Union spelled full-scale economic disaster for North Korea, while the South, instead, was thriving thanks to the model imported from the US and their trading ties. Over the years, the North started isolating from the rest of the world, and although surprisingly it is part of both the ASEAN Regional Forum and the United Nations, North Korea has a series of strained diplomatic relationships with most of the Western countries, while unsurprisingly, its closest allies are two other totalitarian dictatorships, China and Russia. Who else do you think would be an ally of a country with systematic violations of human rights, whose population is one of the most poor and famished in the whole world, constantly bombarded with propaganda, and excluded from the rest of the world? Birds of a feather. Anyways, in 2006, North Korea announced it had conducted its first nuclear weapon test, which brings us to the present tensions in the region. Most likely, this isn't the first time you've heard of North Korea testing missiles around the coasts of Japan and escalating international tensions. And every time it did, these actions begot the question, why now and what are they trying to achieve? In my opinion, there's mainly 3 reasons for this. The first is an internal consensus reason. Even the most powerful and repressive regime in the world needs an amount of active consent, or at least silent acknowledgement, from its population. Just look at Russia right now. The constant military failures are most likely straining Putin's hold on the military and the oligarchs, and he's trying in any way to get some results to appease those who matter for his hold on power. Going back to North Korea, the country has a history of showcasing its alleged military capabilities around symbolic anniversary or holidays. As a matter of fact, this latest reel came as North Korea celebrated one of its most important holidays, the ruling party's Foundation Day, and this test was touted by the regime's propaganda machine as the peak of its might. The second reason is that, most obviously, this is a warning for enemy countries. The Korean Central News Agency, the state propaganda's outlet, recently announced that the latest test launches served as a severe warning to the nation's enemies, after the US held naval drills with its allies South Korea and Japan. Pyongyang blamed these naval exercises for quote-unquote openly posing a threat and to have performed a military exercise accordingly. The fact that North Korea resumed its military drills and not just resorted to military parades directed at its population means, in my opinion, that it's trying to stay relevant on the international scene in a moment where the focus has shifted elsewhere, in Ukraine with the war, and on what's happening between China and Taiwan. And as a spoiled child crying for attention, apparently now North Korea plans on resuming nuclear weapons testing, a first since it stopped them in 2016. And while this for sure puts all its enemies on high alert, it is also a problem for its allies. And this brings us to what I think is the third reason for what it's doing. The South Korea spy agency notes that the North has completed preparations at an underground tunnel at Punggye-ri, a nuclear testing site, and that it could conduct a blast between October 16th and November 7th. This nuclear test would happen between the US midterm elections and an important congress of China's Communist Party. This specific timeframe, I think, shows how North Korea is trying to show its relevance not only to its enemies, but most importantly to its most powerful ally, China. Let's not forget that North Korea's status as an international pariah is not absolute only because of the support that a nation as powerful as China is providing it. Given both China's historical and contemporary behavior with its closest allies and territories, North Korea is trying desperately to avoid being considered useless and therefore absorbed. It's important to notice that one of the most recent times when tensions grew between Beijing and Pyongyang was in 2006, exactly because of China's concern over North Korea's nuclear program. That said, for what concerns Japan, these provocations come at a time when the Kishida administration is also dealing with challenged relations with Russia and China. The North Korea missile launches, as well as concerns over China's own arsenal, have prompted Kishida's government to consider, and I quote, every option to drastically strengthen the country's defenses, including the acquisition of a controversial counter-strike capability that would allow Japan to target enemy bases and command nodes. Going in this direction would go against Article 9 of Japan's own constitution, which states that Japan refuses war as a means to resolve international disputes. But it would just be the latest move from an LDP-led government towards the full-fledged rearming of Japan. In other news, let's look at how Japan is dealing with tourism. On Tuesday the 11th, the government rolled out a nationwide travel discount program that applies only to residents, in an effort to boost domestic tourism and help restarting the suffering sector after years of inactivity. But although the funding of the program is organized by the central government, the management of the discounts and all related policies are being handled by the single prefectures, which has caused a lot of confusions in the past days. There are differences from place to place on what the discounts can be used for, on how much they amount to, on the policies for COVID vaccination and testing, and some prefectures have even delayed the enactment of this program to later this month, in an attempt to provide more clear information to the travelers. All these issues are putting a lot of strain on travel agencies and hotel operators, and this confusion will prove to be another headache for Kishida's government, which, as said before, is desperately trying to jumpstart the tourism industry. This attempt was paired with the complete reopening of the border to international tourism. If you remember, because of the very strict COVID policies the government enacted, Japan had been closed to all international travel, even non-national residents coming back home. And since June 2022, the country reopened its borders to international tourism, but with severe limitations. Now that the economy is faring for the worst and the yen is weak, the government thought that by reopening the border completely without any impacting limitation, it would have caused a surge in travelers, but that did not happen. Tuesday was the first day of unrestricted independent travel, but that day most people in Japanese airports were either returning nationals or people traveling for business. The lack of tourists could be caused by a number of factors, most importantly, the unwillingness of Chinese tourists to go out of the country due to Beijing's strict zero-COVID policies on returning travelers. This could also be because this is the off-season and we're in a moment of a world-scale tension that is damaging the general economy and wealth of most rich countries. In addition to that, All the U-turns that the government had on its own travel policies in the past 3 years aren't probably inspiring that much trust in the general public, who might be afraid of being stuck in Japan and waste a lot of money if the COVID situation worsened once again. Therefore, the hopes of the Japanese government to jolt the economic recovery through the tourism industry look a long way from becoming reality. The yen indeed continues to plummet, and it has now reached its lowest since 1998. And as such, at one full year of Kishida's first steps in office, the promises of economic change he made have been left unfulfilled. As a matter of fact, Kishida vowed to shift the economy towards a new form of capitalism, but because of the inflation, the fall of the yen, and all the political scandals I mentioned in previous videos, his agenda hardly moved forward. During the LDP presidential race for which he became prime minister, Kishida acknowledged that the neoliberalism and market orientation that characterized Abenomics, an umbrella term for former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's economic reform, had created wealth and growth for the country, but also argued that those fruits hadn't been spread equally and that a redistribution of wealth was crucial. At 1 year since his rise to power, we have yet to see any meaningful change, and on the contrary, it seemed that his stance on the matter has veered towards a position more in line with Abe's faction of the LDP. That is it for this week. Sorry if the videos I'm publishing have such inconsistent lengths, but it's a tough period and I'm still trying to find a good routine with this work. I'm also trying to work on another series of videos, so stay tuned for something I hope you'll find very interesting. As always, thank you for watching and see you next time.